He humiliated me in front of hundreds at a $1 million wedding, bragging that he stole my $20 million trust fund. Everyone whispered, everyone stared, and I stood there silent, letting him think he'd won. What he didn't know was that I was already 10 steps ahead. I had the proof, the allies, and the perfect plan to take back everything he stole, and more. By the time he realized it, his empire was already crumbling. This isn't just revenge, it's justice. The valet barely had time to take the keys from my hand before I caught the first curious glance. It was the kind of look that slid over you like silk and left a faint burn behind, as if it carried judgment wrapped in politeness. Bellview Historic Resort shimmered under the late afternoon sun, its white columns framed by cascading flowers and twinkling lights. The wedding was everything Olivia Carter had ever dreamed of, a Charleston fairy tale with a 7-piece jazz band, champagne fountains, and guests in designer gowns flown in from across the East Coast. I adjusted the strap of my navy dress and walked through the marble foyer into the grand ballroom. The scent of gardenias mingled with the buttery aroma of hors d'oeuvres. Conversations swirled around me, soft laughter, the clinking of glasses, the low hum of wealth that had forgotten the meaning of restraint. People stopped mid-sentence when they saw me. I caught a whisper, faint but sharp enough to sting. "That's her, the Dawson girl who squandered her parents' fortune." I kept walking, chin lifted just enough to signal I didn't care, even though every step reminded me how little I belonged here anymore. It had been years since I'd returned to Charleston, years since I'd allowed myself to face the ghosts hidden in the manicured gardens and the genteel smiles. Olivia looked radiant, floating through the room in a champagne-colored gown. She spotted me across the crowd, her eyes widening slightly with surprise. She was my niece by technicality, though we were only 5 years apart. Her smile faltered for half a second, then she glided toward me with practiced grace. "Emily, I didn't know you were coming," she said, her voice light but uncertain. I managed a polite smile. "It's your wedding. How could I not?" She hesitated, her gaze flicking over my shoulder, and I followed it instinctively. And there he was, Robert Dawson, my uncle, my parents' brother, the man who for all intents and purposes held the keys to everything I'd lost. He stood near the bar in a perfectly tailored gray suit, glass of bourbon in hand, laughing with a cluster of men I vaguely recognized from old business meetings. His hair was silver now, but his posture carried the same easy confidence I remembered from my childhood. When his eyes landed on me, they glimmered with something almost predatory. He smiled slow and deliberate, the kind of smile that made your stomach tighten even before he said a word. Olivia touched my arm, murmured something about greeting more guests, and drifted away. I stayed where I was, frozen in place for a heartbeat, until Robert detached himself from his circle and began to make his way toward the center of the room. "Ladies and gentlemen," his voice rose effortlessly above the music. "May I have your attention for just a moment before the toasts begin?" The jazz band softened, and the crowd turned toward him like a tide shifting direction. He raised his glass eyes, shining with faux warmth. "Today, we celebrate love. We celebrate family, and we celebrate the beautiful future of Mason and Olivia." A polite murmur of agreement rippled through the room. My stomach twisted. "But while we're here together, I also want to share something personal, something that means a great deal to me," Robert continued. I felt his words cutting through the air, even before he aimed them at me. There are times in life when we are called to step up to protect what matters, to ensure that family legacies do not fall into the wrong hands. A few guests nodded, unsure where he was going. I stood absolutely still, my fingers tightening around the stem of the champagne flute I hadn't yet touched. Some of you may remember my late brother Thomas Dawson and his wife Elaine Robert went on his tone almost reverent. When they passed, they left behind a significant estate, over $20 million, meant to secure a bright future for their children. My breath caught in my throat. Unfortunately, not everyone is equipped to handle such responsibility. And rather than see it vanish through careless decisions and reckless choices, I made the difficult but necessary decision to take control, to safeguard it. The room erupted in low whispers. Heads turned toward me like iron filings to a magnet. My cheeks burned, but I didn't move. $20 million, Robert said with a faint smirk, is far too important to be squandered by someone unfit to manage it. I did what any responsible guardian would do. I took it back. A soft gasp somewhere to my right. Someone muttered, "Oh my God." I didn't flinch. I didn't give him the satisfaction. Robert's smile widened. He lifted his glass in my direction, a toast that was anything but kind. Sometimes family must protect family from themselves. The silence that followed was suffocating. I felt hundreds of eyes on me, heavy with judgment, pity, curiosity. I sipped my champagne slowly, forcing my hand to remain steady. The music stumbled back to life. Conversations restarted awkwardly. Robert turned back to his circle of friends, triumphant. I set my glass down on a passing tray and quietly excused myself from the crowd. My heels clicked against the polished floor as I walked toward the terrace doors, away from the murmurs, away from the suffocating smell of wealth and betrayal. Outside, the night air was cool and damp, carrying the faint scent of salt from the harbor. I exhaled slowly, gripping the railing as I stared out over the city I'd once called home. I should have expected this. I should have known he wouldn't waste an opportunity to humiliate me. Behind me, the ballroom glittered on the laughter and music muffled through the glass doors. My phone buzzed in my clutch. I pulled it out. A message from Ethan Blake. "Check your email. It's time." I opened it, and the first line made my pulse quicken. I found proof. I glanced back once at the ballroom. Robert was still inside, surrounded by admirers, oblivious. My jaw tightened. I would not walk away this time. Robert's voice cut through the hum of the crowd like a blade. "You should be thanking me for saving this family from someone so unfit." His words were loud enough to draw glances from the nearest tables. A few guests exchanged uncomfortable looks, the kind that held sympathy, but also a spark of curiosity they could not suppress. I turned slightly, catching his gaze. His smile was cold and deliberate, designed to press every nerve he knew I still had. Olivia, standing near the dessert table with her new husband Mason, froze. Her fingers tightened around her bouquet, and for the first time that evening, she looked unsure of the world she had stepped into. "Dad, maybe this isn't the time," she said softly, her voice almost pleading. Robert waved her off with a flick of his hand. "The time is exactly now. People should know the truth." Liam was standing a few feet away, his jaw tight. He had our mother's dark eyes, and in them I saw confusion mixed with something that looked a lot like disappointment. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Is any of this true?" "Emily," I didn't answer. "Not here. Not like this." Instead, I placed my empty glass on a passing tray and straightened my shoulders. There was no point in arguing in front of a room full of people who had already chosen which side they believed. I walked away without a word. My heels echoed on the marble floor as I slipped past clusters of guests, each one turning to watch me leave like I was some tragic character in a story they would retell over cocktails. The hallway was dimly lit, lined with gilded mirrors, reflecting fragments of myself. My pulse was loud in my ears. I needed air, but more than that, I needed control. For a moment, leaning against the cool wall, I let the memories come. The night my parents died was still clear even after all these years. The phone call that shattered everything, the silence of the house when I returned from college in New York, the smell of lilies at the funeral. Robert had been the first to arrive to wrap his arms around Liam and me, telling us we were not alone. He handled everything, the estate, the lawyers, the trust fund that was supposed to secure our future. Back then, I believed him. A soft voice pulled me back to the present. "I thought I might find you here." I turned, and there he was. Ethan Blake. He looked different from the last time I saw him in Boston, a little older, sharper, his sandy hair now cut shorter. He held a phone in his hand and a knowing look in his eyes. "You shouldn't let him do this to you," Ethan said quietly, glancing toward the ballroom. "He thrives on moments like these." What am I supposed to do? Start screaming in the middle of Olivia's wedding? No. You're supposed to fight back the right way." His tone was calm, steady. He stepped closer, his voice dropping. "I have something for you." My heart skipped. I've been digging into his financials for the last few months. You were right to suspect him. And now I have proof. I stared at him, my throat tightening. Ethan held up his phone. "I sent it to your email just now. You need to read it. It will change everything." I blinked, my fingers already itching to grab my own phone. "But be careful," Ethan added. "This is bigger than just a stolen trust fund." Before I could respond, footsteps echoed down the hall. Liam appeared at the far end, his expression tense. "Emily, what is going on? He's saying things I can't ignore. Is he lying?" I met Liam's eyes, the same eyes that had watched me fall apart years ago. He had stayed in Charleston closer to Robert, closer to the version of our family that still looked polished from the outside. I could see he wanted to believe me, but Robert's words had planted a seed of doubt. "Not here," I said softly. "Please." Liam hesitated, then shook his head. He turned and walked back toward the ballroom without another word. I exhaled slowly. Ethan placed a hand lightly on my arm. "Don't let him drag you into the mud, just read what I sent you." I nodded. Back inside, the music had started again, masking the tension that still hung in the air. Guests were laughing too loudly, sipping champagne too quickly, pretending the awkward scene hadn't happened. Robert was near the center of it all, his laugh booming as he charmed a group of men in dark suits. I didn't linger. I made my way to a quiet corner of the terrace, away from the glass doors, away from the eyes. I opened my clutch and unlocked my phone. The subject line glared at me. Proof of forged documents. I tapped it open. There it was. Scans of signatures side by side. My father's handwriting from the original trust documents, and next to it the crude attempt at imitation that Robert had submitted to the court to gain control of the entire estate. Attached were wire transfers to a company I had never heard of. Kingsley Ventures, a shell corporation linked to an offshore account in the Caymans. My fingers trembled slightly as I scrolled. Ethan's message was concise, just a few lines. "He's been siphoning money for years. Kingsley Ventures is tied to David King. Follow that and you'll see the rest." The night air felt colder suddenly. Behind me, the ballroom doors opened. I turned and saw Robert step onto the terrace. He didn't see me at first. He was on the phone, his tone casual but sharp. "Yes, it's handled," he said. "She won't be a problem, not after tonight." He ended the call and finally noticed me. "Ah, Emily," he said, slipping the phone into his pocket. "I wondered where you had gone." "I didn't move. You should be more grateful," he continued. "Do you have any idea how badly you could have embarrassed yourself? You would have lost everything within a year." "I did you a favor." "A favor?" I repeated, my voice steady. "Yes, a favor. One you'll understand someday when you grow up." He smiled, that same infuriating smile he'd given me inside. I slipped the phone back into my clutch, my mind already spinning. I wasn't ready to show my hand. Not yet. Robert tilted his head, studying me. "Don't look so serious. Enjoy the party." He walked past me and back into the light of the ballroom. I stayed where I was, staring out into the dark, my pulse steadying. I finally had what I needed. It was only the beginning. I left the terrace and slipped quietly through the side corridor of the resort, past the framed portraits of Charleston's old elite, and into the back garden. The dim light from the ballroom spilled onto the manicured lawn, but could not touch the edges of the shadows. I found a bench near the fountain and sat down, the cool stone pressing through the thin fabric of my dress. My fingers tightened around the clutch, still holding Ethan's email. The sound of distant laughter carried through the glass doors behind me, but it felt far away, like another world. It had been 10 years since the night everything changed. I could still see the headlights through the rain on the windshield that night, the way the car spun out of control on the wet highway just outside Savannah. My parents had been driving home from a charity gala. I was in my dorm room at Columbia University when the call came. They were both gone instantly. No warning, no last words. Robert was the one who stepped in. He arrived at the funeral with Liam, his hand resting on my brother's shoulder like he was already claiming us. He took care of the details, the estate paperwork, the endless legal jargon that blurred together in those weeks. I was 22, drowning in grief, and I let him. I let him handle everything. I thought about the day we met with the family attorney in the mahogany-paneled office downtown. Robert had smiled so reassuringly as the lawyer explained the Dawson family trust, the $20 million meant to secure my and Liam's future. He promised he would oversee it until we were ready to take control. He even signed papers that day, telling us it was just a formality that he was acting as a temporary guardian. For years, I believed him. It wasn't until I graduated law school and took a job in New York that I started to notice things. The quarterly statements didn't make sense. Investment reports were missing. I asked Robert about it once during a Thanksgiving dinner in Charleston. He brushed it off, saying I was overthinking and that some funds had been reallocated for better returns. When I pushed again, his voice turned cold, the kind of cold that froze me mid-sentence. "Trust me, Emily. You wouldn't understand the details. I understood enough to know something was wrong." I remembered sitting at my apartment desk late at night flipping through stacks of reports I had requested from the bank. There were discrepancies, transfers I could not trace. Carter Holdings appeared several times, but never with any explanation. Back then it was just a name, nothing more. I cried that night, silent tears falling on the papers spread across the desk. I was a newly minted attorney, but I felt powerless against a man who had been pulling strings for decades. My phone vibrated softly in my lap, pulling me out of the memory. I unlocked it again and opened Ethan's email fully. There was more than just the forged signatures. Attached was a detailed flowchart he had compiled. Dawson Family Trust at the top, arrows pointing to multiple shell companies, each one layered under another. Kingsley Ventures, Redwood Partners. And there it was, again, Carter Holdings. All of them linked back to David King, a name I vaguely remembered from old charity galas. I tapped one of the files Ethan had attached. It was a bank transfer confirmation, a series of payments from Southern Capital Bank in Charleston to an offshore account in the Cayman Islands. The amounts were staggering. Millions siphoned over the course of years. I scrolled down to Ethan's note at the bottom. Carter Holdings is the key. David King is his partner. Follow the board members. It all connects. I stared at the screen, the glow of it reflected in the fountain's water. My heart pounded with a different rhythm now. Not fear, not humiliation. Resolve. Footsteps crunched softly on the gravel behind me. I turned, half expecting Robert, but it was Olivia. She looked pale, her makeup slightly smudged like she had been crying. "Emily," she said hesitantly. I didn't answer immediately. She stepped closer, her heels clicking nervously on the stone path. "I had no idea he would say those things. I told him to stop, but you know how he is." I looked at her. "Did you know?" Her eyes widened. "Know what about the trust? About what he did?" She shook her head quickly. "No, I swear. Dad keeps everything about business locked up tight. Mason doesn't even know the details." Mason? My mind flickered to the brief glimpse I had caught earlier, the way he seemed nervous, distracted. Olivia sat down beside me on the bench. "I'm sorry, Emily." This was supposed to be my day, but he made it about himself. I nodded slightly, not because I forgave her, but because I didn't have the energy to explain what was unraveling. She hesitated, then said, "Be careful with him. He's not the same man he used to be." I almost laughed at that. He had always been this man. It just took me too long to see it. Olivia stood and smoothed her dress. "I should go back inside. People will notice I'm gone." She gave me a small, sad smile before turning back toward the lights. I waited until she disappeared through the doors. Then I pulled up the last attachment on Ethan's email. It was a scanned letter dated 3 years ago with Robert's name at the bottom. It authorized the transfer of all Dawson Trust funds to Carter Holdings for long-term asset management. The signature on the letter was supposed to be my father's. I zoomed in. I knew my father's handwriting. I knew the way his T's looped slightly at the top, the way his D's were always precise. This was not his hand. Something inside me shifted. The humiliation I felt earlier was gone, replaced by a quiet, steady burn. I closed the email and locked my phone. The ballroom music swelled again in the distance, a love song for a marriage built on appearances. I stood smoothing my dress and walked back through the garden toward the side exit of the resort. As I reached the valet stand, a memory flashed sharp and sudden. I was 25, sitting across from Robert in his office, holding a stack of financial reports. "These numbers don't add up," I had said back then, my voice trembling. He had leaned back in his leather chair, eyes cold. "Be careful, Emily. You're out of your depth." I wasn't out of my depth anymore. I handed the valet my ticket, feeling the weight of the phone in my hand. I had proof now, proof of his theft, proof of his lies. As the car pulled up to the curb, I glanced back one last time at the glowing resort. I could see Robert through the window, still holding court, still smiling like he owned the world. My grip tightened on the door handle. This wasn't over. It hadn't even started. The next morning I drove into downtown Charleston, the streets still quiet after the wedding chaos that had stretched late into the night. I parked 2 blocks away from a small cafe, tucked between an art gallery and a florist, the kind of place where no one asked questions, and the staff knew to keep their eyes on the coffee machine. Chloe Martinez was already there when I walked in. She sat at a corner table with her laptop open, her dark hair tied back neatly, her posture sharp and focused like always. She looked up as I approached, her expression softening slightly, but her eyes still serious. I slid into the chair across from her, the faint scent of espresso and warm bread filling the space between us. "You look like you didn't sleep," she said quietly. "I didn't." She closed her laptop and leaned in. "I saw what Ethan sent you." I nodded, pulling my phone from my bag. "Carter Holdings, Kingsley Ventures, offshore accounts." "It's all there, Chloe. He's been stealing for years." Chloe's mouth tightened. I always had a bad feeling about Robert. When you told me about the missing funds back in New York, I thought maybe it was a clerical error. But this is deliberate. I stared at the steam rising from the coffee she'd ordered for me. I don't want to wait for a lawsuit. That would take years and he would bury me in appeals. I want to move first. Chloe leaned back, crossing her arms. "There's a way. It's risky, but it could work." I met her eyes. "Tell me." She glanced around the cafe, making sure no one was listening. "Carter Holdings isn't just a shell company. It holds actual assets, real estate minority stakes in legitimate businesses. If we can identify the holding structure, we can quietly buy a controlling interest in one of the feeder companies before Robert moves the funds offshore." I blinked. "You're saying we buy him out from under his own scheme?" "Exactly. We use his own web against him." It was bold. It was dangerous. And it was the only way to stop him before he moved everything beyond reach. "What's the risk?" I asked. Chloe hesitated. "If he finds out what you're doing before you close the deal, he'll tighten the structure and everything will vanish. It would also tip him off that you have proof. You'd lose the element of surprise." I let out a slow breath. "So I'd have one shot." "One," Chloe confirmed. Before I could respond, the cafe door opened and a familiar figure stepped inside. Mason Carter. He was still in his pressed navy blazer from the night before, but the way his eyes darted around the room made him look out of place. He froze when he saw us. For half a second, his gaze locked on mine. And there was something flickering there, something he didn't want anyone to see. Then he forced a smile and nodded politely. "Emily." "Chloe. I didn't expect to see you here." His voice was calm, but I caught the tension in the way his hand gripped the coffee cup the barista handed him. "Just catching up with an old friend?" I said lightly. Mason lingered for a moment too long before clearing his throat. "Well, I should get going. Olivia is waiting." He left without another word, but the unease in his eyes stayed with me. Chloe watched him go. "That man is hiding something." I didn't answer. I had a feeling she was right, but I wasn't ready to unravel that thread yet. My phone buzzed on the table. It was Ethan. I answered quietly. I have more, he said without preamble. Southern Union Bank processed a series of transactions last month that linked directly to Robert's accounts. He's still moving money. How much time do we have? I asked. Not much. If he follows the same pattern, he'll liquidate everything in the next 30 days. I ended the call and looked at Chloe. We don't have time to wait. She opened her laptop again, her fingers flying across the keyboard. I'll start mapping the companies tied to Carter Holdings. There's one called Halston Properties that looks vulnerable. If we can acquire 51%, Robert won't be able to move the assets tied to it without our approval. Can you get me the paperwork? She nodded. I'll need a quiet investor to front the purchase, someone he won't connect to you. Ethan can help with that. I said. Good. But Emily, once you do this, there's no going back. He'll know someone is closing in. I thought of Robert's face last night, the smug tilt of his smile, the way he relished humiliating me in front of everyone. I thought of my father's forged signature, the stolen future, the decade of lies. I'm not going back, I said quietly. Chloe met my gaze and nodded once. Then let's move. She turned the laptop toward me, showing a map of connections, names, companies, and accounts. It was a spider web, each thread leading back to the same core. Carter Holdings, Halston Properties is the cleanest way in, she explained. It's a small real estate investment firm, but it holds a crucial piece of Carter Holdings' asset chain. If we control it, we block at least 30% of Robert's pipeline. I stared at the screen. What's the cost? She typed quickly, pulling up a valuation report. A few million, manageable if we use a front. I'll make it happen. Chloe leaned back. Then we need to move within 72 hours. After that, the window closes. I nodded. Before we could plan further, my phone vibrated again. A message from Ethan flashed across the screen. One more thing. David King is meeting Robert tomorrow. I can get eyes on it if you want. I typed back. Do it. Chloe closed the laptop. I'll draft the documents tonight. Get Ethan to set up the investor cover. By tomorrow evening, we'll be ready to strike. I sat back in the chair, the weight of the plan settling over me. For the first time in years, I felt like I was holding a piece of control in my hands again. When I left the cafe, the sun was higher in the sky, casting long shadows across the narrow street. I glanced down the block. Mason was still there, leaning against his car, speaking urgently into his phone. He didn't see me. His expression was tense, almost panicked. I didn't stay to listen. There would be time to figure out what role he played in all of this. For now, my focus was clear. Carter Holdings was the first domino. As I slid into my car, Chloe's words echoed in my mind. One shot, and I intended to take it. The drive to my grandmother's house took less than 20 minutes, but it felt like crossing decades. Margaret Dawson still lived in the old family estate just outside Mount Pleasant, a sprawling white-columned home with moss-draped oaks lining the driveway. The house had been there for more than a century, holding more secrets than any of us ever cared to admit. I parked in the circular drive and stepped out into the quiet. The air smelled faintly of salt and magnolia blooms. For a moment, I stood there looking at the familiar windows where I used to press my face as a child, waiting for my parents to return from late-night business dinners. Those memories were heavy now, tinged with a sadness that never faded. I rang the bell and waited. A few seconds later, the door creaked open, and there she was. My grandmother was smaller than I remembered, her silver hair pulled into a neat bun, her cardigan draped over her frail shoulders. But her eyes were as sharp as they'd ever been. "Emily," she said softly, her voice warm but tinged with something heavier, something like regret. "Hi, Grandma," I said, stepping forward to hug her gently. She held on for a moment longer than usual before pulling back to study my face. "You look tired." I managed a small smile. "It's been a long few days." She nodded knowingly and led me inside. The house smelled like cedar and old books. The same family portraits hung in the hallway, my parents smiling in happier times. I swallowed the lump in my throat as we walked toward the sitting room. "Sit down, child," she said, gesturing to the couch. "I'll make us some tea." While she moved slowly toward the kitchen, I glanced around the room. Nothing had changed. The same lace curtains, the same antique clock ticking steadily on the mantel. It was as if time had chosen to stand still here while the rest of the world moved on. When she returned with the tea tray, she set it down carefully and sat across from me. For a long moment, she just looked at me. "I heard about the wedding," she said finally. "Robert couldn't resist, could he?" I stared into my cup. No, he couldn't. Her lips pressed into a thin line. "I warned your father years ago about his brother's ambition, but Thomas always believed family could be trusted." I raised my eyes to hers. "Grandma, did you know?" Her gaze didn't waver. I suspected. I knew he wanted more than his share, but I never had the proof. And by the time I realized how far he had gone, you were already grown, and he had buried everything under layers of paperwork. She reached for a small wooden box on the side table. Inside was a single tarnished key. She held it out to me. "Your father gave this to me the week before the accident. He told me if anything ever happened to him and Elaine, this would keep the family safe." I took the key carefully, feeling the cool metal against my palm. "What does it open?" Her voice softened, almost breaking. "The small safe in the library. Your grandfather built it into the wall. No one knows it's there except me. And now you." I stared at her, my heart pounding. "It holds the original documents from your parents' estate," she continued. "The real trust papers. And something else your father wanted you to have." I stood unable to wait any longer, and she nodded toward the library. The library smelled like polished wood and old leather. I moved toward the far wall where the shelves held rows of forgotten history. At the bottom, behind a row of outdated law books, was a narrow panel with a tiny lock. I slid the key in and turned it. There was a soft click. The panel opened to reveal a small safe. Inside were several manila envelopes and a sealed letter yellowed slightly with age. I pulled out the envelopes first. One held the original Dawson family trust document. I opened it carefully and scanned the familiar handwriting. My father's name was clear at the bottom, alongside my mother's stating explicitly that the trust belonged to me and Liam in equal parts. There was no clause granting Robert guardianship beyond temporary management until we turned 25. My chest tightened. The second envelope held financial statements from before the accident, untouched, pristine. They matched the figures I had seen years ago before Robert's alterations. Finally, I reached for the letter. My name was written in my father's hand. I sat down at the old mahogany desk, my fingers trembling as I unfolded it. "My dearest Emily, if you are reading this, it means I am no longer with you. I pray you are safe and strong. I want you to know that the Dawson legacy belongs to you and Liam, not to Robert, not to anyone else. If he ever tries to claim otherwise, know that I trusted you to protect what is ours, and more importantly, to protect the family's name from those who would drag it into darkness. Love, Dad." I pressed the letter to my chest, closing my eyes. For a moment, I felt like I was 22 again, sitting alone in my dorm room with the weight of the world on my shoulders. But now there was something different. I wasn't powerless anymore. When I returned to the sitting room, my grandmother was waiting, her hands folded in her lap. "You found it?" she said quietly. I nodded. She sighed, her voice tinged with both relief and sorrow. "Thomas trusted him too much. I think part of him always wanted to believe his brother could be good." I sat beside her. "I won't let him get away with this." Her frail hand covered mine. "Be careful, Emily. Robert is clever, and he's dangerous when cornered." "I know." She squeezed my hand gently. "Don't let the darkness consume you. Use it, but don't become it." I looked into her eyes and saw the same steel that must have run through my father. "I won't," I said softly. Before I left, she handed me another small object, a silver locket I hadn't seen since I was a child. Inside was a tiny photo of my parents on their wedding day. "Keep this close," she whispered. "It will remind you why you're doing this." I hugged her carefully, feeling the fragility of her frame. Then I stepped back, clutching the envelopes and the letter. As I walked out to my car, the late afternoon sun was dipping low over the trees. I glanced back at the house, its white columns glowing faintly in the light. In my bag was the proof I needed, and in my chest was something stronger than anger. It was purpose. The next afternoon, I sat in a quiet office above a law firm in downtown Charleston, the kind of place where the blinds were always drawn and the air smelled faintly of old leather and paper. Daniel Frost was already there, standing by the window, his gray suit perfectly pressed, his glasses perched low on his nose, as he flipped through a thick folder of documents. Ethan sat across the conference table, his laptop open, the screen filled with charts and flow diagrams. I dropped the envelopes and my father's letter onto the table. Daniel turned, his expression calm but focused. "So, these are the originals," he said, taking the trust documents carefully. I nodded. "Straight from the safe in my grandmother's library. No one has touched them since my parents signed them." Daniel adjusted his glasses and scanned the pages, his brow furrowed. "This makes it very clear. The trust was never meant to transfer control to Robert beyond your 25th birthday. Everything he has done since then is outside his legal authority." Ethan leaned forward. "Which means he forged the extension papers." "Exactly," Daniel replied. "And if he forged those, he likely falsified court filings to justify his management of the estate." I sat down, feeling the weight of it all settle over me. "And the money?" Ethan rotated his laptop toward us. "That's where it gets interesting." I followed the flow of funds from the Dawson Family Trust. Robert didn't just sit on the assets. He funneled them through Southern Union Bank under the guidance of Sarah Miles. She's been helping him move large sums into multiple shell companies, including Carter Holdings. From there, the trail leads to David King. Daniel frowned. "David King, the CEO of Palmetto Capital?" "The same. He and Robert have been running a quiet laundering operation. Robert takes trust money. David invests it into offshore ventures, and Sarah Miles smooths it over at the bank, so nothing looks suspicious on the books." I stared at the screen, my stomach turning. "So it's not just theft, it's fraud and money laundering." Ethan nodded. "And it's bigger than your trust fund. I've found evidence he's pulled the same trick with at least 2 other family estates he manages." Daniel closed the folder and looked directly at me. "If this is true, we're dealing with federal crimes, but exposing it will take precision. If we act too soon, he'll bury the money overseas." I leaned back, my fingers gripping the edge of the chair. "He's already planning to move it, isn't he?" Ethan hesitated. "I think so. There's been a flurry of activity around his holdings in Charleston. Properties being quietly appraised, contracts being prepared. He's getting ready to liquidate." Before I could respond, the door to the office cracked open. Mason Carter stood there, frozen for a moment, as he realized he had walked into something he wasn't supposed to hear. "Emily," he said, his voice tight. I blinked. "Mason, what are you doing here?" He stepped inside, closing the door behind him. "I was meeting someone on the floor below. I heard your name. And Robert's." Daniel glanced at me, then at Mason. Mason's eyes flicked to the papers spread across the table. "Is this about the trust?" I studied him carefully. There was a flicker of panic in his expression, the kind of panic that came from more than simple curiosity. "You already know something, don't you?" I asked quietly. He hesitated. I don't know what you're talking about." But his voice cracked just slightly, and that was enough. Ethan stood, his gaze sharp. "Mason, why don't you sit down?" Mason's jaw tightened. "I can't. I shouldn't be here." He turned to leave, but I stepped into his path. "Mason, what are you hiding?" He looked at me, his face pale. "There's more going on than you realize. Tell me," I pressed. But he shook his head and slipped out the door before I could stop him. I stared after him, my heart racing. Ethan exhaled slowly. He knows something, and it's not just about Robert. Daniel gathered the papers calmly. "Leave him for now. We focus on the plan." I nodded, forcing myself to turn back to the table. "What's our next move?" Ethan tapped a few keys on his laptop. "Chloe is working on acquiring Halston properties. If we can secure that, we'll block 30% of Robert's asset flow. But we need to act fast." As if on cue, my phone buzzed. It was a message from Chloe. I opened it, my eyes scanning the words. "He's moving faster than we thought. Robert is preparing to sell all of his Charleston real estate holdings within the week. He's consolidating the money and sending it offshore. I felt my pulse quicken. Ethan read over my shoulder. That's it. Once it's offshore, it's gone. Daniel's voice was steady but urgent. Then you have a very small window. I swallowed hard, gripping my phone. Chloe's message continued. If we're going to cut him off, it has to be in the next 72 hours. After that, there's no chance of stopping the transfer. I looked at Ethan and Daniel. We have 3 days. Ethan closed his laptop. Then we make them count. The room fell silent for a moment, the gravity of it sinking in. Outside the window, Charleston's skyline glimmered faintly in the late afternoon light. But all I could see was the ticking clock in my head, counting down to the moment Robert would disappear with everything. I straightened my resolve, sharpening. We're not letting him win. Daniel nodded once. Then let's move. And just like that, the plan was no longer a theory. It was real, and it had to happen now. Robert Dawson sat in his downtown office, the one with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Charleston Harbor. From that height, the city looked small and obedient, like it had always been his to control. But today, his confidence faltered. The transfer confirmations he expected hadn't cleared. The sale agreements on 3 major properties were delayed without explanation. He stabbed the phone's keypad with his finger and pressed it to his ear. After 2 rings, a cool female voice answered. Sarah Miles speaking. Sarah, it's Robert. What's going on with Southern Union? My transactions are slowing down. The appraisal should have cleared by now. There was a pause on the other end, just long enough to make his jaw tighten. Robert, she said cautiously, I was about to call you. Something is off. There's been unusual activity on the monitoring systems. Someone is requesting historical records tied to the Dawson Trust accounts. Robert's grip on the phone tightened. Who I can't confirm yet. It might be internal, it might be external, but I think someone is following the trail. His voice dropped a low growl. Are you telling me someone has seen the transfers? Sarah hesitated. Not yet, but if they keep digging, they will. Robert hung up without saying goodbye. He stood by the window, his reflection staring back at him. For the first time in years, he felt something he despised. Vulnerability. His mind raced. Who would dare? Liam was too naive. Margaret was too frail. That left only one name. Emily. He turned abruptly, striding toward his desk. He unlocked a drawer and pulled out a small black notebook, flipping through pages of handwritten notes. Dates, amounts, names. He had prepared for threats before. But Emily, she was smarter than the rest. Robert poured himself a glass of bourbon and stared at the amber liquid. If she wanted a fight, she would lose. Meanwhile, I sat in a quiet corner of a co-working space across town, my laptop open in front of me. Ethan's voice came through on speakerphone. I can leak the first part tonight, he said. Nothing that screams fraud, just enough to make people start asking questions. Do it, I replied. He thrives on his reputation. Take that away first. A soft ping echoed from my laptop as Ethan sent me the draft headline. Prominent Charleston investor faces questions over trust management. It wasn't an accusation, not yet, but it would be enough to shake the walls. I hit send, forwarding it anonymously to 2 local finance blogs known for sniffing out scandal. By morning, it would spread. Across town, Olivia Carter sat in her living room, her wedding dress still hanging in the garment bag by the window. Mason was in the kitchen pacing as he typed furiously on his phone. She had been watching him for days. The tension in his shoulders, the way he stepped outside to take certain calls. Tonight she picked up his phone while he was in the shower. She didn't mean to invade his privacy, but the lock screen was already open. Her eyes scanned the messages. One thread was with someone saved only as Claire. We can't keep meeting like this. Robert is starting to notice. Another message came moments later. If Olivia finds out, everything falls apart. Olivia's chest tightened. Claire. She recognized the name. Claire Whitman, Robert's personal assistant. She put the phone down just as Mason returned, his hair damp, a towel draped around his neck. His eyes flicked to the counter, then back to her. What are you doing? He asked too sharply. Nothing, she said quietly. Just thinking. He nodded slowly, suspicion flickering behind his eyes. Later that night, Mason parked his car in a dim lot behind an old office building. Claire was already there, leaning against her sedan, her face pale under the streetlight. "We're in trouble," she said before he could speak. "What now?" Mason asked, his voice tight. "Robert knows someone's digging. He called me earlier. He asked if I'd seen you talking to Emily." Mason's stomach dropped. Claire stepped closer, her voice trembling. "He told me to tell you this. If you open your mouth about anything, you'll go down with him." Mason froze. She swallowed hard. He said, "Keep it quiet, Mason. Or you drown too." Mason ran a hand over his face, his breath unsteady. He wasn't just tangled in an affair anymore. He was tangled in something that could destroy him. Back at Robert's office, he poured another bourbon and called David King. "We have a problem," Robert said flatly. "Someone is circling the accounts." David's voice was calm but firm. "Then you accelerate. Sell everything. Move it offshore now." "It's already in motion," Robert said, "but I want to know who is behind this." David paused. "Then find out. And silence them." The next morning I opened my laptop to a flood of notifications. The blogs had picked up Ethan's piece. The headline was already circulating among Charleston's business circles. Robert Dawson, under scrutiny for questionable trust practices. Ethan called within minutes. "It's out there. People are talking." I stared at the screen. Good. Let him feel it. By mid-afternoon, Robert was pacing his office again. His phone buzzed constantly with calls from nervous partners. Sarah Miles warned him that a few investors were already pulling back. He slammed the phone onto his desk. Emily. That evening, Olivia sat alone in her bedroom. Mason had left hours ago without saying where he was going. She opened her laptop and searched Claire Whitman. The photos confirmed it. The same woman who had been standing next to her father at countless events. The betrayal settled over her like a heavy fog. At the same time, Mason sat in his car outside Claire's apartment, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. He replayed her words in his head. "Keep it quiet, or you drown too." His phone buzzed with a new message from Claire. "Robert wants to meet. Tonight." Mason closed his eyes, realizing there was no way out. The clock was ticking, and the cracks in Robert's empire were starting to show. I sat at the kitchen table in my small rental apartment, the morning sun streaming through the blinds in fractured lines. My laptop screen glowed with the final draft of an article I had prepared, a carefully edited package of proof that was enough to plant doubt, but not enough to reveal my full hand. I hesitated for only a second before attaching the documents and sending them anonymously to the Charleston Ledger, the most trusted financial outlet in the region. Within 2 hours, the first notifications started appearing. The headline was subtle but sharp. Prominent Charleston investor faces scrutiny over trust mismanagement. Beneath it was a single photo of Robert shaking hands with David King at a charity gala. I could almost hear the ripple effect it caused. My phone buzzed with a call from Ethan. "It's live. They published it on the front page of their business section. It's already trending locally." "Good," I said quietly. "But I'm holding back the bigger piece until we're ready. The offshore accounts, the laundering details, everything else. It'll be a bombshell." I nodded, even though he couldn't see me. Let him sweat first. By late afternoon, the fallout had started. A string of messages from Chloe came in one after another. 2 investors already called to freeze pending deals. He's panicking. The Ledger just reported 3 property sales were halted. He's losing buyers. I allowed myself a small breath of satisfaction. It was working. But the quiet didn't last long. That evening, I stepped out of a cafe downtown where I had been meeting Ethan and Chloe to coordinate the next move. The sky was just beginning to turn gold, the streets calm. As I approached my car, I stopped short. The driver's side mirror hung by a thread, cracked and dangling. Deep scratches raked across the side doors like someone had taken a key to the paint. My stomach dropped. Someone had been here. I crouched to check the tires. The back one was slashed clean through a thin line of rubber curling outward. A text buzzed on my phone at that exact moment. Stop now. You're already in too deep. No sender. No signature. I straightened slowly, scanning the street. A few people walked in the distance, but no one looked suspicious. My fingers tightened around the phone as I exhaled carefully. Inside the cafe, Mason had been waiting for me. When I walked back in, he looked like he hadn't slept in days. His tie was loosened, his hands restless. Emily, thank God you're here. I need to talk to you. I didn't move closer. What do you want, Mason? He leaned in, his voice frantic. I need your help. I tilted my head. Why would I help you? Because if this explodes, I'm finished, he whispered. I raised an eyebrow. Finished how? His eyes darted toward the corner table where Ethan and Chloe were sitting quietly, pretending not to listen. Robert knows I've been involved with Claire. He knows I covered for some of his transactions. If this all comes out, I'm done. Olivia will leave me, the press will ruin me, and he'll drag me down with him. I stared at him, keeping my expression neutral. So you're part of it? Not by choice, Mason said quickly. He forced me into it. Claire told me it was just paperwork. I didn't know what I was signing until it was too late. I leaned against the chair. What are you asking me for? He swallowed hard. If you can protect me, if you can keep my name out of whatever you're planning, I'll give you everything I know. Emails, bank records, meetings with David King. I considered him carefully. That's a big promise. It's all I have, he said, his voice shaking. I pulled my phone out slowly, turning on the voice recorder. And why should I believe you're telling the truth? He reached into his briefcase and slid an envelope toward me. Inside were printed emails between Claire and Robert with Mason, copied discussing offshore transfers. I stared at the words. This proves he's moving everything to Cayman Holdings next week, Mason said. You still have time. I looked up at him. And why not go to the police yourself? He laughed bitterly. You don't understand. Robert has people everywhere. If I go to the police, I disappear. I let the silence stretch, then closed the envelope carefully. I'll think about it, I said. Mason's hand gripped the edge of the table. Please, Emily. If this goes wrong, I'll lose everything. I stood, slipping the envelope into my bag. You already have. I walked out before he could respond. Outside, the sky had darkened. My vandalized car still sat by the curb, a quiet warning. I called Ethan as I walked. Mason gave me something. What proof of Cayman Holdings transfers? Emails tying Robert directly to the offshore accounts. Ethan whistled softly. That's huge. Yeah. But he's scared. Robert's got him trapped. Keep him talking. We might need more from him, Ethan said. I hung up and kept walking down the street, the shadows long and sharp under the streetlights. At that exact moment, Mason stepped out of the cafe, pulling his coat tight. His phone buzzed with a new message. It was from Claire. Robert knows you met Emily. Keep quiet, or you drown with me. Mason stopped in the middle of the sidewalk, his breath shallow. I watched from across the street, hidden in the dark. Robert was tightening his grip, but he didn't know how close I was. The invitation came the next morning, written in Olivia's careful handwriting, and slipped under my apartment door. Dinner at our house tonight, it read. Just family. I hesitated as I held the note. There was only one reason she'd ask for something like this. She wanted to fix what was breaking apart. That evening, I drove to the Carter's townhouse in the historic district. The house glowed warmly from the outside, framed by soft lantern light and a manicured garden. But the air felt heavy as soon as I stepped onto the porch. Inside, the dining table was set for 6. Olivia greeted me with a faint smile that didn't reach her eyes. Thank you for coming, she said quietly. Mason stood behind her, his shoulders tense. Robert was already seated at the head of the table, a glass of wine in his hand, his face unreadable. Liam was next to him, looking tired but composed. The atmosphere was thick with unspoken words. We sat. Olivia served roasted chicken and salad, but no one really touched their plates. I'm glad we're all here, Olivia began softly. I thought maybe we could talk, clear the air. Robert's laugh was low, almost mocking. Clear the air. There's nothing unclear, Olivia. Some people just can't accept where they belong. I kept my gaze steady on him. He turned to me. Isn't that right, Emily? You've made quite a mess lately. Stirring up gossip, sending little articles to the papers. Do you think it makes you look brave? I didn't respond. Liam looked between us, his brow furrowed. Emily, is that true? Did you send those stories? I finally spoke, my voice calm. What's true is that Robert has been lying to all of us for years. Robert smirked. Here we go again with the dramatics. I reached into my bag and placed a single sheet of paper on the table. It was a bank statement. Southern Union Bank. Large transfers into Carter Holdings. I slid it toward Liam. He glanced at it confused. What is this? It's proof, I said quietly. Proof that Robert took money from the Dawson Trust and moved it through shell companies. Robert leaned back, laughing louder this time. This is nonsense. You don't understand the first thing about asset management. I met his eyes. I understand forged signatures. I understand illegal transfers. Liam's voice rose slightly. Emily, do you even hear yourself? You're accusing him of stealing from his own family? I turned to Liam, my tone sharper. He didn't just steal from the family. He stole from us, from you and me. Robert slammed his glass onto the table, the sound sharp. Enough. You think you can walk back into this family after years away and point fingers? Olivia flinched at the sound. Mason shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Liam stood, his face tight. Emily, you're tearing this family apart. I rose too, meeting his anger. No, Liam, he already did that. I'm just showing you the truth. Robert's eyes narrowed. His voice suddenly softer, more dangerous. You're playing a very dangerous game. Before I could respond, Olivia's voice broke through trembling. Stop it! All of you! She was crying now, her hands clutching the edge of the table. I can't do this anymore, she whispered. Mason, tell them. Mason froze. His face turned pale. Tell them, Olivia repeated, her voice rising. Tell them what you've been doing. Mason looked at her helplessly. Olivia, please. She wiped at her tears, her voice shaking. I saw the messages. Claire Whitman, my father's assistant. How long has it been going on? The room went still. Liam's jaw dropped. Robert's eyes turned cold. Mason opened his mouth, but no words came. Olivia pushed back from the table, her chair scraping loudly. And that's not all, is it? You're not just cheating. You're helping him. She pointed at Robert, her hands trembling. You're helping him move money. Mason finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. Olivia. I didn't want to. I didn't have a choice. Olivia let out a choked sound, half sob, half laugh. No choice. You lied to me. You lied to all of us. Robert slammed his fist onto the table, his voice booming now. Enough of this nonsense. Mason did what he had to do. I told him to handle things for the good of this family. The room fell silent. I stared at Robert. For the good of the family, Robert's face twisted with anger. I did what I had to do to protect what your father built. Do you think you could have managed $20 million without burning through it in a year? Liam blinked at him, his voice unsteady. Wait, are you saying you actually did it? Robert straightened, realizing too late what he had admitted. I moved the money, yes, he said, finally, his tone sharp. But it was to keep it safe. Safe, I said, my voice icy. Safe in offshore accounts with your name on them. Liam looked between us, his face pale. Uncle Robert, is this true? Robert hesitated, then pointed at me. She's twisting this. She doesn't understand how business works. But Liam's expression shifted. The doubt was there now, creeping in where blind loyalty had been. Olivia stood in the corner, tears running down her face. Mason sat, frozen guilt written all over him. The air was heavy with silence, the kind that felt like it could crush you. I gathered the bank statement from the table and placed it back in my bag. Robert was breathing hard now, his anger barely contained. "This isn't over," he muttered. I looked at Liam, his eyes wide with confusion, and something else, fear. And for the first time, I saw the crack in Robert's control widening. I met Chloe and Ethan in a rented office downtown, the kind with plain white walls and a single flickering fluorescent light. It was the safest place we could find to talk without eyes or ears nearby. The tension in the room was sharp enough to cut. "We do it now," Chloe said, sliding her laptop toward me. "He's desperate. The articles have ruined his credibility. He's bleeding investors, and he knows it. If we give him something that looks like a lifeline, he'll take it." "What kind of lifeline?" I asked, leaning closer. "A deal," Ethan answered. "We create a fake investment vehicle, something that promises to stabilize his name publicly while secretly binding him into a contract that strips his control. Once he signs, we can use the legal loophole to freeze the assets before they're moved offshore." Chloe pointed at the screen. "It's a fabricated restructuring plan under the guise of a family reputation recovery fund. It looks like a PR move, but in reality it makes him relinquish authority over Carter Holdings and its subsidiaries. And he won't see it. He's too frantic right now to read the fine print," Ethan said. "His network is collapsing. Sarah Miles is already being questioned by the bank's compliance team after the leak." I nodded slowly. "So, we're giving him a rope he thinks will save him." Chloe's lips curved into a faint, grim smile. "Exactly." 2 hours later, Mason arrived. His face was pale, his hands trembling as he placed a folder on the table. Emails, contracts, even a voice recording of Robert instructing him to sign documents on Olivia's behalf. He sank into the chair opposite me. "If I give you this, I need your word my name won't be dragged into the press." "You don't have much choice, Mason," I said quietly. "Either you help us now or you go down with him." He rubbed his temples. "I can get him to come to a meeting. He still trusts me enough." Ethan leaned forward. "That's what we need. Bring him to the office Chloe set up. He'll believe it's an emergency strategy session with investors." Mason looked at each of us in turn, then nodded slowly. "I'll call him." The next day, Mason walked Robert into a high-rise conference room overlooking the river. Chloe and Ethan were already there, dressed in sharp, neutral tones that made them look like corporate advisors. I sat at the end of the table, silent, letting the setting do its work. Robert glanced around. "What is this?" Mason cleared his throat. "It's a way to fix everything." Chloe slid a sleek folder across the polished table. "Mr. Dawson, we've prepared a crisis mitigation plan. It's designed to stabilize your reputation in the press and reassure your partners." Robert raised an eyebrow, flipping through the pages. "And who exactly are you?" Chloe smiled faintly. "The only people left who can help you." He snorted. "I don't need help from strangers." "You do," Mason said, his voice lower than usual. "The ledger piece scared off half your buyers. Sarah Miles is being questioned. And David King, he's already distancing himself." Robert's jaw clenched. "This plan," Chloe continued smoothly, "gives you public backing from a credible fund. It shows you're willing to put your holdings into a protective trust for the sake of transparency. Investors will calm down. The press will back off." He scanned the first page. "And what do you get out of this? Just the satisfaction of fixing a messy situation," Ethan said evenly. Robert hesitated. The thought of losing control burned behind his eyes, but so did the fear of complete collapse. He flipped to the signature page. Mason shifted in his seat, looking sick. Robert picked up the pen. As his hand hovered over the paper, Chloe spoke again, her tone perfectly neutral. "Once you sign, the assets will be legally shielded. No one can question their placement." Robert's pen scratched across the line. I held my breath. When it was done, Chloe calmly slid the signed document back into her folder. "Congratulations, Mr. Dawson. You just handed over controlling rights of Carter Holdings and its affiliates to an independent trustee board." His head snapped up. What Ethan's voice was calm. "Read the fine print. The trust you just signed names a provisional board to manage and freeze all accounts tied to Carter Holdings pending a full audit." Robert's face drained of color. "You tricked me," he hissed. "No," I said, finally speaking. "You tricked yourself." His mouth opened, but before he could speak again, Mason's phone buzzed loudly. He glanced at the screen and swallowed. "It's Sarah Miles," Mason said, his voice shaking. "She's been taken in for questioning by the authorities." Robert stood slamming his palms on the table. "This is not over." Ethan's eyes didn't waver. "It already is." The moment Robert left the room, Chloe locked the signed agreement into a secure file. The emergency injunction was already prepared. Within hours, Carter Holdings' accounts were frozen. The next day, the news broke. Sarah Miles, the longtime president of Southern Union Bank, was under federal investigation for money laundering. Regulators were swarming the bank. David King's name appeared in the headlines as an unnamed executive associate. Robert called Mason repeatedly, but Mason didn't answer. He called Olivia, but she didn't pick up either. By the afternoon, his Cayman transfer window had closed. The funds were locked, the properties unsellable. That evening, I stood by the window of my apartment, watching the sun dip behind the harbor. My phone buzzed with a single message from Ethan. It worked. "He's finished." I looked out at the water, feeling the weight of it all settle into something sharper. For the first time, Robert Dawson was no longer untouchable. The courthouse in downtown Charleston was packed the morning the trial began. Reporters clustered on the steps like vultures, cameras flashing every time someone in a suit walked by. I arrived early with Daniel Frost at my side, his calm presence steadying my nerves. Ethan was already inside, seated behind the press section with his laptop ready. The air was heavy with anticipation, the kind that made every whisper feel louder than it should. Inside the courtroom, Robert sat at the defendant's table, immaculately dressed in a dark tailored suit. His expression was calm, almost smug, like a man who believed he still had the upper hand. His legal team was one of the most expensive in the state, led by Martin Lang, a bulldog attorney known for dismantling witnesses and bending narratives. Olivia sat 2 rows behind him, her hands clenched in her lap. Mason was nowhere to be seen. I wondered if he had already left the city. Judge Hawkins entered her presence, commanding immediate silence. She was known for her no-nonsense demeanor and sharp memory for details. This was not someone Robert could charm. The first few hours were methodical. Robert's team painted him as a benevolent guardian, a man who had stepped in to protect his brother's legacy from irresponsible heirs. They presented fabricated reports carefully crafted to show every transfer as a legitimate reinvestment. Martin Lang stood confidently before the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen, this case is about gratitude turned into greed. My client protected his family's wealth when no one else could." I sat still, my eyes fixed on Robert. He didn't look at me once, but I could feel his attention prickling the back of my neck. Then came his witnesses. A former accountant testified that the transfers were approved by the family. A supposed handwriting expert claimed my father's signature on the extension documents was authentic. For a moment, I saw the jurors glance at each other. Robert's narrative was neat, polished, believable enough for someone who didn't know the truth. When it was our turn, Daniel Frost walked to the center of the courtroom with quiet confidence. "We call Emily Dawson to the stand." I took a breath and stepped up my heels, clicking softly on the polished floor. Sitting in the witness chair, I felt every pair of eyes on me. Daniel guided me gently. "Emily, can you tell the court what you found in your grandmother's library?" I described the safe, the original trust documents, and the letter from my father. When Daniel held up the papers for the judge, the courtroom went silent. "And this is the original Dawson Family Trust." Daniel said, his voice clear. "It explicitly states the assets revert fully to Emily and Liam Dawson at age 25, with no further guardianship granted to Robert Dawson." Martin Lang objected, but Judge Hawkins waved him off. Overruled. Then Daniel presented the second piece. "Your Honor, here is the extension document Robert Dawson submitted to the court in 2017, claiming continued authority." He placed the forged document beside the original. Side by side, the differences in handwriting were obvious. We also have an independent handwriting analysis from 2 certified experts. It confirms the 2017 signature is a forgery. A murmur rippled through the room. Robert shifted in his seat. His jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Daniel wasn't done. "We called Daniel Frost," continued Mason Carter. Mason walked slowly to the stand, his eyes avoiding Olivia's. He looked thinner, worn down. "Mr. Carter," Daniel began, "can you tell the court about your involvement with Carter Holdings?" Mason swallowed hard. "Robert told me to sign off on property transfers. He said it was to protect the family assets, but I later learned they were being moved to offshore accounts." "And did you assist in creating false documents?" Mason's voice cracked. "Yes. He threatened me." Olivia gasped softly from her seat. Robert's face turned red. He leaned forward, whispering furiously to his attorney. Then Daniel revealed the final blow. "Your Honor, I would also like to submit a series of recorded emails and wire transfer confirmations linking Robert Dawson, Sarah Miles, and David King to money laundering through Carter Holdings." Ethan stood in the back, ready. At that exact moment, his article went live online. Phones buzzed throughout the courtroom as reporters read the headline: "Charleston Power Broker, Robert Dawson, linked to fraud offshore laundering scheme." It was like a wave crashing through the room. Judge Hawkins raised her hand for silence. Martin Lang tried to object, but the judge's gaze cut through him. "Sit down, Mr. Lang." When Robert took the stand in his own defense, he tried to keep his composure. "I did what was necessary to protect the family legacy," he insisted. Daniel's cross-examination was precise. "Did you forge Thomas Dawson's signature?" "Of course not," Robert snapped. "Then can you explain why certified experts say it isn't his handwriting?" Robert hesitated. "Did you funnel money through Carter Holdings into Cayman accounts?" Robert's voice faltered. "That was for the family. For yourself," Daniel corrected calmly. Robert's temper snapped. "Do you think you can understand what it takes to keep this family from falling apart? I did what Thomas couldn't. I made the hard choices. So you admit you moved the money." Robert's mouth opened, but no words came. The damage was done. When the closing statements ended, Judge Hawkins didn't deliberate long. "Robert Dawson, this court finds you liable for fraud, misappropriation of trust assets, and intentional deception of beneficiaries. Effective immediately, your assets are frozen, and control of all Dawson properties reverts to their rightful heirs." The courtroom was silent except for the scribbling of reporters. Robert sat motionless, his eyes fixed on nothing. His attorney tried to whisper to him, but he didn't respond. Olivia covered her mouth with her hand, her eyes wide with shock. Liam stared at Robert, realization finally settling in. Mason slipped quietly out of the back door, his face pale. The judge's voice was final. "Furthermore, this court recommends a criminal investigation into money laundering activities involving Carter Holdings, Southern Union Bank, and Palmetto Capital." Robert blinked once slowly. It was over. For the first time in his life, Robert Dawson had nothing left to hold on to. 3 weeks later, I stood once again at Bellview Historic Resort, the same grand ballroom where Robert had humiliated me in front of everyone. But this time the air felt different. Light streamed in through the tall windows, catching the soft gleam of white lilies arranged around the podium. Reporters and invited guests filled the room, their quiet murmurs echoing off the marble floors. I smoothed the lapel of my blazer and stepped toward the microphone. "Good afternoon," I began, my voice steady. "Thank you all for coming." I paused for a moment, letting the silence settle. "Today we are turning a page. For years my family's trust was stolen and misused, not only betraying my parents' legacy, but harming countless others. What was taken has been recovered. And now, instead of holding on to that pain, we're transforming it into something better." Behind me, a large banner displayed the name of the new Dawson Foundation for Financial Integrity, a nonprofit that would fund legal aid for victims of financial fraud. "With the funds we've reclaimed," I continued, "this foundation will help families who have been silenced by those who think they are untouchable. We will give them a voice, and more importantly, a way forward." The applause was soft, but genuine. I saw Ethan standing near the press section, giving me a small nod of approval. After the announcement, I stepped down from the stage and moved through the crowd. Olivia approached hesitantly, her eyes red from tears, but her posture straighter than before. "Emily," she said quietly, I don't expect you to forgive me, but I'm sorry. I should have seen what he was doing. I looked at her and saw not the girl who had looked away, but a woman who finally understood the cost of silence. You were caught in his shadow, I said softly. Now you can step out of it. She nodded, her voice breaking. I'm done with him, completely. Then she glanced behind her where Mason was nowhere to be found. He had left Charleston quietly after the trial, disappearing into a life far from the one he had tried to build. Olivia straightened her shoulders and walked away to speak with the reporters, ready to face her own new chapter. A moment later, Liam came up to me. He looked tired, but there was something softer in his face now. I was wrong, he said simply. I wanted to believe he wasn't capable of it. I didn't want to see the truth. I studied him for a moment, remembering the nights he had defended Robert the way he had doubted me. Then I placed a hand on his arm. We both wanted to believe in family. Liam's voice lowered. Can we start over? I smiled faintly. Yes, we can. He exhaled, relief washing over his features. Ethan joined us, holding a folder in his hand. His tone was quiet but determined. There's more out there. More people like Robert. I've been getting calls since the article went live. I raised an eyebrow. Calls from who? From other families, Ethan said. Victims. People who've been manipulated by the same network. He placed the folder in my hands. We could keep going, together. I opened the folder slightly and saw names, dates, accounts, proof that Robert was just one thread in a larger web. I closed it again and met Ethan's eyes. Then we will. Later that evening, after the reporters had left and the foundation team was finalizing their notes, I walked alone through the empty ballroom. I stopped at the spot where Robert had stood during Olivia's wedding, glass raised in triumph as he tore me down. But now there was no trace of him here. His voice no longer echoed through these walls. I thought of my parents, of the letter my father had left me, of the trust he had placed in me to protect our name. I had done more than that. I had turned their betrayal into something that could protect others too. Ethan found me by the window where the harbor glimmered in the evening light. You did it, he said simply. No, I replied, my voice soft. We did. We stood there quietly for a moment, watching the lights of Charleston flicker on as the sun dipped below the horizon. Sometimes revenge isn't loud. Sometimes it isn't a single moment of victory. It's patient. It's quiet. It's letting the truth do the work you could never force. I turned back toward the empty room, my voice calm but steady. Sometimes silence and patience are the strongest revenge of all. If someone betrayed you, someone you trusted completely, would you stay silent and endure it? Or would you take the first step to change everything?